Hi, welcome to an introduction to logic. This is a video series that introduces students to the basic concepts in logic, and in particular, we're looking at categorical, propositional, and predicate logic. Although you don't need a textbook to watch the videos, we are following a textbook, and we're using the textbook A Concise Introduction to Logic by Patrick Hurley, and we're using the 11th edition. This is one of the most widely used textbooks for logic within the country, and so I think a lot of people will find this video helpful. This textbook is frequently used, of course, in undergraduate courses. We're going to look at a lot of different concepts throughout this video series. There's actually going to be 40 different videos. But in this first one, we're just looking at really the basic of basic concepts. We're looking at arguments, premises, and conclusions. And we're going to be following along with the Patrick Hurley's discussion of that same thing. Though you'll see that I don't necessarily agree with everything Hurley says, or at least I don't put it the same way Hurley does. But it's a great textbook nonetheless. Let's just start off with a real basic question here, which I think sort of deserves some discussion right from the outset before we sort of get into what arguments, premises, and conclusions are. And let's start with this question. What exactly is logic, right? You may have, if you've never taken a logic course before, I'm sure you've heard the term logic. You know, of course, Captain Spock in Star Trek, he talks about logic. What exactly is logic? I think there's a great, even though logic goes back all the way to the ancient world with the writings of Aristotle and even Plato, um, logic is, I think the best example or best sort of quick phrase about what logic is comes from a philosopher by the name of John Locke. Many of you may, in government or even your introduction to philosophy courses, may have heard of John Locke. John Locke is a modern philosopher, and he said that logic is the anatomy of thinking, of human thought. And I think that's a great way of thinking about what logic is. So we're going to give this answer. Logic is the study of the anatomy of thinking. And for all of you watching out there, I'm sorry my handwriting isn't always the best. But it's the anatomy of thinking. And I think that's a great way to think about it, because what exactly is anatomy? Anatomy is the study of the different is a subset of biology, and what anatomy does is anatomy studies the different organs within a body and how those organs function together. And in many ways, that's what logic is. Even though we can't see them, there's certain organs, or at least there's certain organs in our minds that allow us to think in certain ways, and to think correctly. And this is an important distinction. There is a difference between correct reasoning and incorrect reasoning. Whoops, he's an ugly guy. Correct reasoning versus incorrect reasoning. What exactly counts as correct reasoning? Well, to reason, first and foremost, there's lots of different things we do when we think, we can imagine, right, and this sort of thing. But we'll see that the sort of thinking that logic is concerned with is the form of reasoning that's contained in its reasoning, oops, for some reason, in argumentation. And in fact, we'll see that what logicians study essentially are the forms, or rather the structures of reasoning that allow us to make arguments. Now, of course, what exactly is an argument, right? We can keep asking this question. What is an argument? Well, an argument is essentially, it's composed of two different things. First off, an argument is always contains a premise, or at least one, but usually multiple premises. And the second thing that it contains is a conclusion. The premise is supposed to support the conclusion, right? So you can think of the premise as the evidence that we give when we make claims. And that's really, to put it simple, that's what I want you to think of as an argument. Argument is essentially when you make a claim, you assert something is true, right? When you say that something's the case and you provide evidence for it. That's, in the most rudimentary sense, what an argument is. And we'll see that Logic studies arguments, and the most critical basic feature are the premises and the conclusions of our arguments. Okay. One thing too we should make clear, since this is the first video, let me open up a new template here. One of the things that I want to quickly reference here is that in there's different domains within logic, right? The first domain of logic, the one we're going to be looking at, is what we might call formal logic, formal or symbolic logic. And I'll talk about what that is in a minute. The other type of logic here, generally speaking, is informal logic. And we'll see that the basic difference here is that formal logic seeks to analyze whether or not an argument is a good argument, whether or not it can support its claims, by analyzing the form that that argument takes. Whereas by contrast, informal logic is concerned with the content of our thoughts. So let me give an example here, because that may sound fairly sort of obscure, the difference here between form and content. And I want to give you a very classic argument that goes all the way back to Aristotle, and it contains 3 lines, 3 statements. The first statement here is that all men are mortal. Right? Socrates is a man. Therefore, and here, just watching the video, you'll know what comes next. If all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then therefore Socrates is, what is it? He's mortal, right? He's mortal. And this is a standard form sort of syllogism, actually. We're going to use this term later on, especially when we look at categorical logic. But an argument that takes this shape is known as a syllogism. Okay. All men are mortal, Socrates is man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, why is this interesting here? Because this argument we'll see is actually a valid argument, which means that it's a good argument, uses correct reasoning. But guess what we can do? We can take each one of these 2 things. This is here a premise. This is a premise, so there's 2 premises, and then this is the conclusion down here. Okay, but what's amazing actually is that logicians, going all the way back to Aristotle discovered that these take a specific form. What if we took, you'll see that these have different words that sort of reappear over and over, right? Socrates and mortal. And these are what we call terms. And what happens if we symbolize the terms with letters? So let's do that now and rewrite this. It looks like all M are T, right? And I'm going to slightly change it just to sort of make it a little clearer. Well, you'll know why later on in the other videos. Let's say all persons named Socrates are M, men. Therefore, all persons named Socrates are T, for mortal. You can see here, this was our T, this was our S, this was our M. Okay, so this is essentially what I've done is I've symbolized this argument into its form, right? You can see I've stripped out the content. We're not talking about men or mortality anymore. We're just looking purely at the arrangement of the terms. And the reason that what's fascinating about this is that if I replace any of these terms with something else totally different, right? Something like all plants are things that have cell walls, right? Pine trees are things that are plants. Therefore, pine trees are things that have cell walls, for instance. If I can replace any one of these terms with with different content. In the argument, though, regardless of what words I use or what terms I use, will always turn out to be logical. This is 100% correct reasoning. No matter what I'm talking about. No matter what I'm talking about. Now, of course, you can see here, so what is formal logic study? Formal logic basically takes all sorts of different arguments, puts them into formal analysis, and then we mainly just look at the forms and try to determine whether or not the reasoning is correct. Now, let's go back up to here. What about informal logic? And when I'm talking about content, what exactly does that mean? Well, what if I gave a different example? What if I took the form of the reasoning, but I put in to the variables here terms that really that aren't real, that are not true. For instance, what if I changed the M here by saying that M is unicorns, T are one-horned animals, S here would be Susie. So it looks like this. All unicorns are one-horned animals. All things named, all persons, all animals identical to Susie are unicorns. Therefore, all animals identical to Susie are one-horned animals. See, that argument uses the same form of reasoning and it's correct in that sense, but the content is the problem. Because since unicorns don't exist, that means that I've made a logical mistake there. I'm talking about things that aren't real. Okay? So informal reasoning, and we'll talk about this. Formal reasoning is concerned with content to a certain degree. But informal logic studies essentially the content and the ways in which we can arrange our arguments and our premises and our evidence and the way we think, in fact. There's a similar difference here, though it's not identical, between deductive reasoning, which is usually associated here with formal logic, but they don't mean the same thing, and also inductive reasoning, which is by definition actually informal logic. So we're going to talk about that here in another video, but I want to get you to see this is essentially what logic is, and logic provides us with an absolutely fabulous way of assessing arguments ultimately. And you may not realize it, but everywhere you go, people are trying to convince you to believe things. Everywhere you go. On YouTube, your friends, at your school, at your church, on television, advertisements, everywhere where you go. In fact, perhaps maybe more than in any other time in history, you're confronted with arguments. You're confronted you're confronted with claims, right, to believe. People want you to believe things. But unfortunately, the majority of the things that people ask you to believe actually use incorrect reasoning. And that's what we call a fallacy. A fallacy literally means a false argument, right? And so what we want to do is we want to assess the claims that we're confronted with in order to determine what we should actually believe. And this is really, really, really important. Especially think about politics, for instance. Politicians make lots of claims and they give reasons for their claims, which means they're giving us arguments. But we have to assess those to determine whether or not they're logical. So this is effectively what logic studies. Okay, so let's move down here and make another distinction here. These are all claims, right? But these are not arguments, right? In order to fully understand what arguments are, we have to also look at what are not arguments, right? These are merely statements. These are merely statements. And you combine statements together to create arguments, right? And you can see here's the number of them, right? Chocolate truffles are loaded with calories. Melatonin helps relieve jet lag. Political candidates always tell the complete truth. Now, we know that's not true, right? No wives ever cheat on their husbands. That's not true. Tiger Woods plays golf, and Maria Sharapova plays tennis, okay? These are all statements, but they're not arguments. They're not arguments because they're just singular statements, right? In order to have an argument, we have to combine multiple statements together, right? Such that they relate, right? So we have some statements we're going to talk about as premises, and some statements we're going to talk here about as conclusions. What's the difference? The conclusion is the claim you're supposed to believe, and the premises, or the premises, this is the evidence that you're supposed to base the claim off of, right? So you can see it works like this. You have premises and conclusions. Now, one of the things that's interesting is in ordinary arguments, a lot of times the conclusions and the premises are mixed up. You're gonna see here that in logic, we're gonna abide by what's known as standard form notation, which means that the premises are always gonna come first, right? And the conclusion will always come last. And in a standard form proposition, we're only going to always have two premises and one conclusion. But I think that is the subject of a video coming up here. That's the first thing to think of. By contrast, I want you to notice that a lot of the there's lots of different statements in the world that don't count. So there's lots of different things that people can say that don't count as statements, right? Because they don't actually claim anything. For instance, if you ask a question, if you propose something, if you suggest, if you tell someone to do something, if you yell out, fantastic. These are sentences. Well, they're not even sentences. Let's say they're utterances. But they don't actually, but there's no claim, right? So they don't count, right? They're not statements in the logical sense of the term, right? They're just purely utterances. And so one of the things you need to do is we need to learn slowly, and really just through pattern and repetition, learn to differentiate what matters because in an ordinary sort of conversation, people are going to tell us a lot of different things. They may have questions combined with evidence, combined with suggestions and claims. And one of the things we have to do to analyze arguments is we have to sort through and figure out what matters and what doesn't. Strictly speaking, this stuff doesn't matter. What matters, what we really want to be worried about here are, what you really want to be worried about here are whether or not it makes a claim, and is the claim properly supported. And then finally, of course, the subject of logic in its more proper sense, when we get to categorical or propositional or predicate logic, is whether or not they're formally organized in a way that allows them to be correct forms of reasoning. Now, here's two examples we can take of arguments. Two examples of arguments. Here's the first one. All film stars are celebrities. Haley Berry is a film star, therefore Haley Berry is a celebrity. Okay? We can already see that this is the first premise, this is the second premise, and we would say this is the conclusion. Okay? And even though this is really organized, you can see this is organized, not in perfect standard form, but fairly close. Right? And you can see here the terms: film stars, celebrities, Haley Berry, film star. Right? Those are the terms. Okay, let's take a look at this one over here. Let me change the color of my pen here. First off, you can see there's terms. This is some film stars are men. Cameron Diaz is a film star, therefore Cameron Diaz is a man. Now, this is a good example, right? Because this is actually organized correctly, but you can see the difference here because this is not true, right? It's true that well, let's actually just analyze. This is the first premise, this is the second premise, and this is the conclusion. Now, what's the difference here? This is actually a correct form of reasoning. It follows. And by saying it's correct, what we mean is that this argument, in terms of its form, is what we would call truth functional. Meaning, and this is why I'll explain why this one's wrong and this one's correct, right? Meaning that since it's organized in a story where these terms are in the specific order, the way we looked at it earlier, since it's organized correctly, it means it's truth functional, meaning that if these first two premises are true, then the conclusion will also be true, necessarily. It will always be like that. If the premises are true, the conclusion will be true. Now, be careful here, because if I have a false premise, then the conclusion will turn out to be false. Right, so you have to. That's the content issue there, right? You have to make sure that film stars are celebrities and stuff like that. Now you can see here this may actually be a false premise. All film stars are celebrities. Well, I guess if you're a star, by definition, you are a celebrity. So yeah, I think it is valid. But what about this one? This says some film stars are men. Notice the difference here. Not all. Some film stars are men. Cameron Diaz is a film star. Therefore, Cameron Diaz is a man. You can see here that this has two premises and a conclusion, but it uses poor reasoning. We'll say this is a poor argument. Why is it poor? Well, because here, look at the premises. This first premise is true. Some film stars are men. Cameron Diaz is a film star. That's true. She's not my favorite film star, but she is a film star. So the premises are true, but look, the conclusion here is false, which means that this is not truth functional. Okay? So an argument that's a good argument that uses correct form of reasoning is truth functional. It's as if you pour truth into the premises, a conclusion will always spit out that's true. Whereas poor reasoning is when you pour truth in and falsehood comes out at least once, right? And unfortunately, the grand majority of arguments probably that exist in the media today, or maybe in the world, are poor arguments. They're like this. So our goal is to figure out in formal reasoning what sort of forms are truth functional, and then always argue like that. And then of course we can use this as a tool to assess how other people argue. So these are two different arguments. Now, how are you supposed to figure out what the conclusion is? How are you supposed to figure out what the conclusion is? The first thing you should do when you actually hear, read, or I guess you hear or read an argument is you should figure out what the conclusion is. And I would say ask your a simple question. Ask this question: what is the takeaway? What does the person who's arguing whatever it is you're hearing, right? What is the takeaway? What is the claim they want you to agree with and believe? That's what the conclusion is going to be. Now, usually, most conclusions, because of the way human language proceeds, we use words, and we're going to call these conclusion indicator words. We use certain words that help us to recognize the conclusion. The most typical one you'll see is therefore, wherefore, thus, consequently, we may infer, accordingly, we may conclude. I mean, the conclusion's right there, right? It must be that for this reason. So, this is a very, I'll circle the ones that are common. So and therefore, these are fairly common. Entails that, hence, it follows that, right? That's also known, implies that as a result. So, one of the first things you use, ask just for when you read an argument first, what is the takeaway? And if you can't figure the takeaway, number two, search for the indicator term. Search for the indicator term, right? Because even though there's formal logic, we're going to take arguments that are explained in ordinary language, formalize them, and analyze them, but we have to figure out what the conclusion is. So you got to look for that indicator term. If you can't find an indicator term, or you can always look for the premise indicator terms. Oftentimes, the premise. Remember, a premise counts as the reasons you give for the claim, right? In the premise, these words usually come right before the premise. You say, for instance, you say, dogs are great animals since, right? There's a premise indicator term, since they've biologically evolved with human beings, right? So evolved with human beings is the premise to the conclusion that dogs are great pets or something. Okay, since, as indicated by, because this is probably the most common. In that may be inferred as, given that, seen that, for the reason that. That's pretty common. I think since is a common one too. So you can always, number three, right, after you've looked for the, what do we have up here? After you've asked what the takeaway is and searched for the indicator term, I guess then you take a look at the premise indicators, right? So number three, search for the premise, for the premises by taking a look at the indicator terms, okay? That's the sort of, let me scroll down here. Okay, so let's give some examples here. These are some basic core examples you need to take a look at. Let's take this argument. Expectant mothers should never use recreational drugs since the use of these drugs can jeopardize the development of the fetus. Okay, so first off, ask yourself, one, what's the takeaway? Read it again. Expectant mothers should never use recreational drugs since use of these drugs can jeopardize the development of the fetus. The takeaway is that pregnant women shouldn't use drugs, okay? Which means that notice here, there was no indicator term. We can just sort of sit back and figure out what it is. Best thing to do when you see this is underline the conclusion if you're using a textbook or something like that. Underline the conclusion. Now let's take a look. Where's the premise? Well, notice there is a premise indicator term, since the use of these drugs can jeopardize the development of the fetus. So we'll say this is premise one. Let's erase that. And this is conclusion one. There's only one conclusion and one premise here. Okay, so that's an example of how you can do these problems. Let's do another one here. It's vitally important that wilderness areas be preserved, for wilderness provides essential habitat for wildlife, including endangered species, and it is a natural retreat from the stresses of daily life. Okay, this one is, right as this thing says, this one is a little bit more difficult, right? So let's say, first off, let's ask ourselves, what's the takeaway? Okay, let's read it again. It's vitally important that wilderness areas be preserved. For wilderness areas provides, okay, this word for, this is a premise indicator term, right? This is what comes after this is going to be a premise or a reasoning. For wilderness provides essential habitat for wildlife, including the endangered species. And look, here we have another term, and. It is a natural retreat from the stresses of daily life. So what we see here is that this first statement, it is vitally important that wilderness areas be preserved. This is the conclusion, actually. Well, let's put C1 for conclusion. And then here we have, for wilderness areas provide essential habitat and is natural retreat from stresses of daily life. This here is going to be premise. To make it simple, I'll circle the conclusion here. Right? This is premise 1. And then this thing here, this is premise 2. Now, what is this thing right here? This is an indicator term, but what's this and? This and is going to be known as a conjunctive. And don't worry too much about that right now, but a conjunctive, it means that it's a term that allows us to conjoin two different premises together, right? So, but you can see here, the best thing to do, because in the homework you do after this, is you really just have to stop and just think slowly about what's being said here, okay? Here's another example. The space program deserves increased expenditures in the years ahead. Not only does the national defense depend on it, but the program will more than pay for itself in terms of technological spin-offs. Furthermore, at current funding levels, the program cannot fulfill its anticipated potential. Okay, what's the conclusion? The conclusion, like the other ones we've looked at, sorry, I erased it, is this first statement. The space program deserves increased expenditures in the years ahead. Okay, so this is the conclusion. Now, not only does national defense spin up, but the program will more than pay for itself in terms of spin-offs. You can see this is sort of a complicated one, but this thing here is a premise, right? Because this is trying to support the conclusion that we need more money for it, right? And then this furthermore, this is another one of these conjunctive terms, right? At the current funding levels, the program cannot fulfill its anticipated potential. This is also a premise, right? This one was a little bit more tricky, but again, I think the simplest way is really to sit back and ask yourself, what's the takeaway? Now you'll notice here, I want to make a distinction here between statements. Let's just put this is a distinction that you should know. A difference, a distinction is just talking about a differentiation, two concepts that are different. Statements versus propositions. Okay, and this is actually a very critical distinction within logic. Now, what's a statement? A statement is really the actual utterance, or sentence. This is the actual utterance. Jeez, that's horrible handwriting, isn't it? It's the actual utterance, or it's the sentence itself. Whereas the proposition isn't the utterance, but we would say that the proposition is what is meant by the sentence or the utterance. We're talking about the meaning, okay? So statements, right, essentially, this is the grammar, this is the sentence, whereas the proposition here is the meaning. It's the meaning of the claim. So for instance, think about it like this. Let me say it like this. We can take this statement here. The space program deserves increased expenditures in the years ahead. But the meaning is not the same as that, right? Or it doesn't have to be that way. Because think, I could actually say that same thing differently. I could say, for instance, NASA needs a greater budget, so that NASA needs to spend more money. Or no, I guess let me say this. NASA deserves to spend more money in the future, right? That NASA needs to spend more money in the future means The space program deserves increased expenditures in the years ahead, right? So I can have two different statements that are actually the same proposition. And the reason that that's really actually important is because one of the things you're going to see in here is that as you go through this course, is that oftentimes when you read a full argument, let's say in a newspaper or something like this, let's say you read a newspaper editorial, right, where some sort of argument is being made. Oftentimes, people will say the same thing in multiple ways, which means they'll give multiple propositions, right? They'll give multiple sentences, but all of them combined, really, there's just one proposition or just a handful. We'll put a handful of propositions, right? So one of the tasks you have to do when you evaluate arguments is figure out what the meaning of it is, figure out what the propositions are, and actually analyze the form that the propositions are given rather than the syntax, the grammatical sentence structure, right? So this is a pretty important distinction to make as well. And because so we've talked here about the idea that arguments and statements can have truth values. There's such a things as non-statements. There's conclusion and premise indicator terms, and also the difference here between propositions. And one thing I forgot to mention that is in this chapter that's worth remarking here is the concept of inference, right? And this is sort of one of the things that's really exciting about this course. And one of the things I think you'll find is that if you do well in this course, you actually have to sort of get interested and excited about this stuff and see it something is sort of a game and rather than a boring dry subject. An inference. What is an inference? I said that, right, correct reasoning forms in such a sense that arguments can have truth functionality, right? And that means that the truth can flow from the premises necessarily to the conclusion. This notion of flow that I'm talking about is what I mean is really inference. So that means that you can infer from the premises the conclusion. Okay, so inference is the technical term here to talk about how truth can flow from the premises to the conclusion. So that's what I want you to think of when we talk about inference. It's maybe not the most technical term for inference, technical definition, but I think it's a very helpful one. Let's see here. I want to show you. Let's exit this. Let's see here. Okay. Here, I'm sorry. Let me show you this. In fact, let me give you the exact definition here that comes from your book. And inference, in the narrow sense of the term, is the reasoning process expressed by the argument, or analogously, a proposition in the narrow sense is the meaning or information content of a statement. Okay, so that's the sort of general sense here about what an inference and a proposition are. Okay, now there is a note here about the history of logic that I'd like you to read in your book. I'm going to cover this more in another lecture. So most of the lectures here that I'm posting are purely just about the mechanics of learning logic and the basic concepts. We will be talking about the development of logic though. And I'd like you to read these in the textbook, and we'll be talking about them later. This mainly talks about the idea, it sort of gives you a brief overview of the history of logic, beginning with Aristotle, and I think working all the way up into contemporary mathematicians like Kurt Gödel, or for instance, Bertrand Russell. Contemporary in the larger sense of the sense, right? They lived in the 20th century. But this sort of gives you an overview. But you'll see here that now that you've listened to this video, if you have the textbook and you're following along with the text, then I'd like you to go here to exercise 1.1, or if you're using Applia, you can work on the problems that are assigned for you. You can see that what are you supposed to do in these exercises. The first thing you're going to do is look for conclusions and premises, right? And you're going to sort of get arguments, and then what you need to do is using the letters P and C, identify the premise and conclusion of each argument. Oftentimes it's helpful to circle as a result, for instance, to circle these indicator terms, right? As a result, was that a conclusion or a premise indicator term? Do you remember? I hope you do. Okay, and you can see that that's essentially what most of your homework is for this section 1.1, is essentially taking a look at these sort of um, core, really simple arguments, and then from there, doing a short analysis. In the second section here, and what's interesting is these are really real arguments that people have made. Okay, and the following arguments in the second section, which you're going to need to do, is in order to fully understand, you have to rephrase the conclusion, right? You have to move away from looking at the sentence or the statement in order to determine what the proposition is and then figure out it from there, okay? So that's essentially what your homework is for 1.1. Now, before